Welcome to our deep dive into the world of propaganda.
Ooh, sounds intriguing.
It is, and you've shared some really fascinating material on this topic.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Yeah, we've got Jukka Ohala's book, Propagandan, lyhyt, oppimäärä, to unpack today,
Okay.
which I think is going to give us a lot to think about.
I'm excited.
Now, I have to admit, when I hear that word propaganda,
Yeah.
I instantly picture like those old war posters.
Yeah.
The ones with the bold slogans and the pointed fingers.
Right. Those classic images.
But this book, it goes so much deeper than that, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It really expands that definition.
Yeah.
Ohala takes us beyond those kind of simplistic images and shows us that propaganda is woven into our daily lives.
It's everywhere.
It is everywhere. It's from the advertising that shapes our desires to the narratives that shape our worldview.
It's true. It made me realize just how much of what we accept as truth is actually shaped by forces that we might not even be aware of.
Yeah, it's a really powerful concept.
And Ohala, he takes us through this whole history of persuasion, showing how propaganda has evolved over time.
Right from the very beginning.
Yeah, did you know that the word propaganda itself actually has roots in the Catholic Church?
Yeah, that's a fascinating bit of history.
Yeah.
It goes back to the 17th century,
Okay.
when Pope Gregory V established this organization called the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide,
Wow.
which translates to Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith.
So essentially spreading Catholicism.
Exactly. Their goal was to spread Catholicism, and they did this by disseminating information.
Shaping public opinion.
Shaping public opinion, essentially early forms of propaganda.
I never would have made that connection.
It's surprising, isn't it?
Yeah, and it just goes to show that this has been around for centuries,
Yeah,
adapting to new technologies and new social contexts.
right.
The book highlights how the printing press was a total game changer.
Oh, yeah, mass production of persuasive materials.
Exactly. And then came radio and television.
Oh, and that brought those messages right into people's homes.
Right into their living rooms.
Powerful stuff.
And that brings us to a point that I found a little unsettling. In the United States, we actually had a law in place that prohibited the government from using propaganda on its own citizens.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Oh.
And that law was repealed in 2013.
2013, that's recent.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what's changed. Has our understanding of propaganda shifted, or have the government's approach to influencing its citizens evolved?
That is a really good question, something to ponder.
It is, and Ohala's book really encourages us to think critically about these shifts, to examine the narratives that shape our world. And he emphasizes how selecting what to say, and even more importantly, what not to say, can profoundly influence public perception.
It's all about controlling the narrative, isn't it?
It is framing the information in a way that guides people toward a specific viewpoint.
Exactly. And that brings us to this concept of the Overton window.
Yes, the Overton window.
I find that so fascinating.
Me too. It describes the range of ideas that are considered acceptable in society at any given time.
Right. What's acceptable to talk about.
Right? And the fascinating part is how this window can be manipulated
Yeah.
to make certain viewpoints seem unthinkable or even dangerous, while others gain mainstream acceptance.
It's like a spectrum of acceptable opinions.
Yes.
And propagandists can try to shift that spectrum.
To suit their agenda.
It's making me think about all the things I've just accepted as common sense without really questioning them.
Me too. And that's the power of propaganda. It often operates beneath our conscious awareness.
It's subtle.
It is shaping our beliefs and values without us even realizing it.
We need to be more vigilant.
We do. We need to constantly question the information we encounter and the sources it comes from.
That's what the book is urging us to do.
It is. So how do we become more critical consumers of information, especially in today's media landscape?
Well, Ohala highlights the power of storytelling.
Okay.
He argues that even fictional stories can shape our understanding of the world and influence our actions.
Wow.
He brings up this idea of the big lie technique.
Oh, right. The one where a lie is repeated so often that people start to believe it.
Exactly. And it's often outrageous and shocking.
Yeah. I've always heard it attributed to Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister.
Right, but Ohala actually claims he was referencing Winston Churchill's tactics.
Interesting. So the source of that technique is debated.
It is.
But the point is that repeating a lie, even a ridiculous one, can make it seem more believable.
Especially when you combine it with other persuasive techniques.
So it's not just about the message itself, but how it's delivered and how often it's repeated.
Exactly. Repetition is key.
And that brings us to the modern battleground for propaganda, The internet.
Oh yeah, the internet has become a breeding ground for all of this.
It has, with its vast reach and speed.
We're bombarded with information from all sides.
It's overwhelming.
How do you even know what to believe anymore?
Right, and it's not just about those overt forms of propaganda.
Like what?
Like those biased news articles or political campaigns.
Right.
Ohala also talks about these more subtle forms of manipulation.
Like what?
Like how social media algorithms control what we see in our feeds.
Oh yeah, they're controlling what we're even exposed to.
Exactly. The book highlights concepts like shadow banning,
Shadow banning, what's that?
where your posts are hidden from most users without you even knowing.
So you think you're participating, but no one's seeing it.
Right. Your voice is essentially silenced in online discussions.
That's creepy.
It is. And he also talks about the role of bots and trolls.
Oh yeah, those are everywhere.
They're spreading disinformation and creating chaos online.
It's like a whole other level of manipulation.
It is. And you mentioned this term astroturfing earlier.
Oh yeah, astroturfing.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, astroturfing is basically creating these fake grassroots movements.
Okay.
So it's like manufacturing this illusion of popular support for an idea or a product.
Okay, can you give me an example?
Yeah, imagine you see this whole social media campaign,
Okay.
hundreds of accounts, all praising a certain political candidate. It looks like genuine support, right?
Yeah, it looks like a lot of people are behind this person.
Exactly. But it's actually orchestrated by a small group with an agenda.
So devious.
It is. It's making it seem like there's this widespread agreement on something.
When in reality, it's just a carefully constructed illusion.
Exactly.
And it makes you wonder, how susceptible are we to all of this?
Right. Are we just pawns in this game?
Well, Ohala doesn't paint a very rosy picture.
What does he say?
He suggests that our brains are practically wired to be influenced.
Oh, no.
He points out some of our cognitive vulnerabilities,
Like what?
like confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias. Remind me what that is.
That's our tendency to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs.
Oh, yeah. Even if it's flawed.
Exactly, even if it's misleading.
Oh, that makes sense.
And then there's the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Dunning-Kruger, that's a mouthful.
It is where people overestimate their own knowledge and abilities.
So they think they know more than they do.
Exactly. And that makes them less likely to question information that seems to align with their perceived expertise.
So even if we think we're being critical thinkers, our brains can trick us.
They can, into accepting information that reinforces our biases.
It is a sobering thought.
It is, but being aware of these cognitive biases is a good first step
Okay.
toward becoming more discerning consumers of information.
So we're not helpless.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Ohala's book doesn't suggest that.
Okay.
By understanding the tactics used against us, we can start to see through the smoke and mirrors.
Okay, so knowledge is power.
It is. In this case, it really is.
So what's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, I'm really curious to hear more about Ohala's analysis of controlled opposition.
Controlled opposition. What's that all about?
Well, you mentioned it earlier, and it really intrigued me.
Fill me in.
He suggests that sometimes those in power, they create or support seemingly dissenting voices
To what end?
to control the narrative.
To control the narrative, so it's like fake dissent.
It can be.
Yeah.
It might involve creating fake opposition groups or promoting individuals who appear to challenge the establishment.
But they're actually serving the establishment's interests.
In subtle ways.
Yes. That's fascinating and disturbing.
It is. It suggests that even dissent can be manipulated to serve the interests of those in power.
So how does he say this tactic is being used in modern propaganda?
Well, he points to a number of examples, but he emphasizes that it's often difficult to prove definitively.
Right.
He encourages us to be critical of any source, even those that claim to be challenging the status quo.
So question everything.
Exactly, because sometimes manufactured dissent can be a way to divert attention from more legitimate criticisms,
Oh, I see.
or to create a sense of false balance, giving the illusion of a fair and open debate when that might not actually be the case.
That's a valuable insight.
It reminds us to be wary of easy answers and
Yeah.
to dig deeper, especially when we're encountering information that seems to confirm our existing biases.
So we have to fight that confirmation bias.
We do. Now, before we move on, I know you mentioned that Ohala tackles the role of the media in all of this.
Right.
And I'm curious to hear more about his perspective.
Well, he makes a bold statement right from the start.
What's that?
He argues that there's no such thing as objective media.
Wow.
Yeah, he believes that all media outlets have inherent biases and agendas, even if we happen to agree with them.
That's a provocative statement.
It is.
But it does make you think about how our own beliefs and preferences shape our media consumption.
Right.
We tend to gravitate towards sources that reinforce our worldview.
We do. It's comfortable.
It is. Ohala encourages us to step outside of our comfort zones
Okay.
and consider alternative viewpoints, even those we might initially disagree with.
So expand our horizons.
Exactly. He argues that exposure to a diversity of perspectives is crucial for developing those critical thinking skills.
And resisting manipulation.
Exactly.
Right.
So it's not about finding the one true source of information,
Right.
but rather about understanding how different sources present information and why.
Understanding their motivations.
Exactly. And he also touches on the rise of citizen journalists
Okay.
and how their unfiltered footage can sometimes disrupt those carefully crafted narratives.
Interesting.
He suggests that those in power often view this unmediated flow of information as a threat to their control over the message.
I can see why they would feel threatened.
Right. It raises questions about the power dynamics at play in the media landscape.
Who benefits from controlling the flow of information?
Exactly. That's a big question, and one that we need to be asking.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I'm eager to dive deeper into this. Shall we move on to Ohala's analysis of specific propaganda techniques and how to identify them?
Let's do it. I'm ready to become a propaganda detective.
Me too. Let's go.
So we've talked about how propaganda has evolved over time, and how it's so prevalent online in those subtle ways. It kind of messes with our thinking.
Right.
But what can we actually do about it?
Yeah. That's the question, isn't it?
How do we become more savvy, in this world that's just saturated with all of this?
Well, luckily, Ohala gives us some tools.
Okay, good, because I was starting to feel a little helpless.
I know it can feel overwhelming,
It really can.
but he gives us a sort of toolkit for analyzing propaganda.
Toolkit, okay?
Yeah, it's like a step-by-step process that we can use to kind of deconstruct a message and try to understand, like, what are the underlying motives?
Okay, so like becoming a propaganda detective?
Exactly.
I like that.
And one of the first things he says is to identify the source of the message.
Okay, that makes sense.
Who's behind it? What are their interests? What are their biases?
Yeah, but we don't always think about that, do we?
No, we often just take information at face value.
Right, we just assume it's true.
Right, and those motivations can be complex.
It's not always black and white.
No, it's not always like some evil mastermind trying to trick us.
Right.
Sometimes it's about subtle framing or emphasizing certain aspects of a story while downplaying others.
Okay, so it's about perspective.
Yeah. And Ohala reminds us that even those seemingly objective sources,
Right.
they can have biases,
They can.
whether conscious or unconscious.
So it's about understanding the lens through which that information is being presented.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
And he also encourages us to look for emotionally charged language or imagery.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
It is propagandists. They often rely on appeals to fear, anger, or patriotism.
Right, to get us riled up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
To bypass our critical thinking
Okay.
and elicit that emotional response.
So think about those political ads that use that dramatic music
Right.
and the scary images.
Yeah, to make you feel like something terrible is going to happen.
It's like they're trying to short-circuit our brains
They are.
and go straight for the gut,
And it's effective.
especially when we're feeling anxious or uncertain.
Absolutely. Ohala has this great line. He says, "The simplest form of white propaganda is to carefully select what to say as well as what to leave unsaid."
That's so true.
It is sometimes what's left out of a story
Right.
can be just as revealing as what's included.
We need to pay attention to that.
We do.
What are they not telling us?
Exactly. Another technique is to look for logical fallacies.
Logical fallacies like inconsistencies in their arguments.
Yeah, is the argument based on solid evidence?
Okay.
Or is it full of assumptions, generalizations, or straw man arguments?
Right, because propagandists, they often rely on flawed logic.
They do, hoping that people won't notice.
Right, they just kind of gloss over it.
They do. It's like a magician using sleight of hand
Oh, I like that analogy.
to distract you from what's really going on.
Okay, so we need to slow down and examine the evidence
Yes.
and ask ourselves, do the conclusions actually make sense?
Exactly. And Ohala also stresses how important it is to be aware of our own biases.
Oh, right, because our biases can really trip us up.
They can, and how they might influence how we perceive information.
Right, we tend to see what we want to see.
We do. It's that confirmation bias we talked about earlier.
Right, our brains are always looking for evidence that supports what we already think.
Even if it means ignoring evidence to the contrary.
It's so hard to be objective.
It's a constant challenge to stay open to new ideas and to be willing to change our minds when we're presented with new information.
Right, because we think we know everything.
It's easy to fall into that trap.
So this is where Ohala's suggestion to consider alternative viewpoints becomes really important.
Yes.
If we're only hearing one side of the story,
Right.
we're missing out on the full picture.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle with only half the pieces.
Exactly.
So seek out diverse sources of information,
Even if they make us uncomfortable.
even if they challenge our worldview.
Okay, got it.
And he even says to analyze both pro and anti-propaganda messages
For the same issue.
for the same issue.
Okay.
So compare and contrast.
To see the techniques being used?
Exactly. It's like a game,
A game, okay.
trying to spot the agendas and deconstruct the strategies.
I like that.
And Ohala provides this checklist of questions to ask yourself.
Okay, what kind of questions?
Well, what are the goals of the message? Who's the intended audience? What techniques are being used to appeal to that audience?
Okay, so it's like a framework.
It is a framework for dissecting propaganda,
Okay.
seeing through its disguise.
I like that.
And he encourages us to pay attention to the media channels being used to spread the message.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Is it coming from a trusted source?
Right, one with a good track record?
Exactly. Or is it
Yeah.
being spread through more covert channels,
Like what?
like social media or online forums or websites with a clear agenda?
Okay, so thinking about the platform itself can give us clues?
It can, about the message's intentions.
Okay.
And finally, he asks, what is the overall effect of the message?
Okay.
Does it promote critical thinking and understanding?
Okay.
Or does it aim to stir up emotions and division?
Because that's often the goal, isn't it?
It often is. Propaganda often aims to manipulate our emotions.
To provoke fear, anger, outrage.
Yeah, it's about getting us to react.
Not think.
Exactly. So be aware of your own emotional responses.
Okay.
And ask yourself, are those responses being intentionally manipulated?
That's a good point.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
But there's another layer that we haven't really touched on.
Okay.
Ohala also delves into the methods that are being used by those in power
Okay.
to control and manipulate information online,
Okay.
which creates a whole new landscape for modern propaganda.
Right, because the internet is like this Wild West.
It is, and he highlights how algorithms used by those tech giants,
Right.
they can effectively silence dissenting voices.
And control the narratives.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not always about outright censorship.
Right. It can be more subtle.
Sometimes it's about these little tweaks to algorithms that determine what content we see.
And what we don't see.
Exactly. And it raises ethical questions about the power these platforms have.
And how they're using it.
It's disturbing to think that we might not even be aware of the information that's being kept from us.
Right. Or how our online experiences are being curated.
Without our consent.
It's like we're living in a filter bubble.
Exactly. And he also talks about the role of bots and trolls.
Ugh, bots and trolls.
In spreading disinformation and creating chaos online.
They're the worst.
And these aren't just random individuals posting inflammatory comments.
No, they're organized.
They often are. They're part of these coordinated campaigns with specific goals.
Like what kind of goals?
Well, it might be to sow discord or discredit opponents or manipulate public opinion.
So they have an agenda.
They do. It often feels like the internet is a battleground for information warfare,
A battleground, yeah.
where different factions are fighting to control the narrative.
And that's a scary thought.
It is. And in this environment, it's more important than ever to be discerning about the information we consume.
And to verify its accuracy.
Exactly. So how do we navigate this online minefield?
It's tricky, right?
It is.
Yeah.
Well, one important step is to be aware of the sources we're relying on.
Okay.
Are we getting our information from reputable news organizations?
With a track record accuracy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or are we relying on social media posts, blogs, or websites with a clear agenda?
So check the source.
Always check the source. And even with those reputable news organizations, it's important to be aware of their potential biases.
Right, because no news source is perfectly objective.
No, they're not. It's about understanding the perspective from which they're reporting and seeking out a diversity of viewpoints.
So get multiple perspectives.
Exactly. And he also talks about the rise of citizen journalism and independent media outlets,
Right.
arguing that they can offer a valuable counterbalance to those dominant narratives that we often see in the mainstream media.
Okay, that makes sense.
But even with citizen journalism,
Yeah.
we need to be cautious.
Why is that?
Well, anyone can post anything online,
That's true.
and it's often difficult to verify the authenticity of information.
Especially images and videos.
Exactly. They can be easily manipulated.
So we can't just take everything at face value.
No, we need to develop our critical thinking skills and our ability to fact check.
Good advice.
And Ohala also talks about the importance of lateral reading.
Lateral reading? What's that?
That's where you cross-reference information across multiple sources
Oh, okay.
to try to get a more comprehensive and accurate understanding.
So don't just read one article.
Right. Read several, compare and contrast.
You look for the common threads.
Exactly. It helps you to identify those potential biases and uncover any missing information and develop a more nuanced perspective on an issue.
So it's not just about being aware of those persuasive techniques, but also understanding the systems of control that are shaping the information we see.
That's right. We need to be aware of the power dynamics at play and develop strategies for resisting manipulation.
So taking control of our information consumption.
Exactly. Becoming active participants rather than passive consumers.
Ohala's book is really a call to action, isn't it?
It is for all of us to be more conscious and critical.
Now, you mentioned earlier that he had some concerns about citizen journalists.
Yeah.
How they can sometimes be used to manipulate narratives. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Sure. So, well, Ohala acknowledges the potential benefits of citizen journalism.
Right, in terms of holding power accountable.
Exactly, and providing alternative perspectives.
Right.
He also cautions that it can be exploited.
By who?
By those seeking to spread disinformation or manipulate public opinion.
Oh, so it can be used for bad?
It can?
Can you give an example?
Well, someone might stage an event and film it and present it as spontaneous citizen journalism.
But it's actually fake.
It's actually orchestrated.
Wow, that's sneaky.
It is. So it's a reminder that we need to be just as critical of information coming from citizen journalists.
As we are of information coming from mainstream media.
Exactly.
It's all about being discerning.
It is. And another concern is that citizen journalists often lack the training and experience of professional journalists.
Right.
When it comes to things like fact-checking and verifying sources and presenting information in a balanced way.
So it might not be intentional.
Right? They might just not have the skills.
But it can still spread misinformation.
And so it's not about dismissing citizen journalism altogether,
Right.
but approaching it with a healthy dose of skepticism.
And critical thinking.
Just like we should with any source of information.
Good advice.
And it's also important to be aware that citizen journalists can sometimes be targeted or manipulated.
By who?
By those in power.
Okay.
For example, a government or corporation might try to co-opt citizen journalists
To do their bidding.
to spread their propaganda or to discredit their opponents.
So they're being used.
They can be.
That's a concern I hadn't considered before.
It highlights the need for citizen journalists to be aware of these potential pitfalls.
And to maintain their independence.
And their integrity.
It's a tough job.
It is. And it also reinforces the importance of media literacy for all of us.
Right.
We need to develop the skills to critically evaluate information from any source, to identify those potential biases and make informed decisions about what we believe and what we share.
So we all need to be media savvy.
We do. It's essential in today's world.
Wow, it's amazing how much ground we've covered.
Yeah, it really makes you think. It does. I'm left wondering, after this whole deep dive into propaganda, does knowing about all these techniques, does that actually make us immune to them?
That is the big question, and I appreciate that Ohala doesn't give us any easy answers.
Right.
Awareness is definitely important.
It has to be the first step.
It is, but it's not a magic shield.
Right. It's like learning the rules of a game.
Yeah.
You might know how the game's played.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you're going to win every time.
Exactly. You can still get outmaneuvered.
Right. There are still skilled players out there.
Exactly. We have to be vigilant. We have to constantly challenge our own assumptions and biases.
Because even when we think we're being objective,
Right.
our brains can trick us.
We see what we want to see, believe what we want to believe.
It's like that saying, it's easier to fool someone than to convince them they've been fooled.
It's so true.
And it's hard to admit when we've been taken in,
It is. It's humbling.
It is to acknowledge our own vulnerabilities.
Yeah, nobody wants to admit they were wrong.
No, and the thing is that techniques of propaganda are constantly changing.
Involving.
They're evolving, yeah, adapting to new technologies and new social contexts.
So what worked yesterday might not work today.
Exactly. And what works today might be obsolete tomorrow.
So we have to be adaptable.
We do.
We have to keep learning.
Constantly updating our understanding of how all of this works.
It's a challenge.
It is. It sounds like what we need is this kind of mental flexibility.
Right.
This willingness to question everything and to be open to changing our minds.
Right. But how do we do that without becoming cynical?
Yeah, without losing trust in everything.
That's the balancing act, isn't it?
It is. It's finding that sweet spot between healthy skepticism and open-mindedness.
Discerning but not dismissive.
Right. Critical but not cynical.
It's a tough one.
It is. So it's not about rejecting all information,
Right.
but about developing those skills to evaluate it, you know?
To filter out the noise.
Yeah, separate the wheat from the chaff, as they say.
I like that.
And that brings us back to those practical steps that Ohala outlined.
Okay.
For analyzing propaganda, it's about asking those critical questions.
Like what?
You know, who's the source? What are their motivations? What techniques are being used? What's being left out?
Right. Those key questions.
And recognizing that propaganda isn't always about those blatant lies.
Right.
It can be much more subtle.
Operating through suggestion.
Implication.
Emotional manipulation.
It can be about what's not said.
Right.
Those stories that are ignored or downplayed.
To missing pieces.
Exactly. It's about being aware of the narrative that's being presented and asking ourselves who benefits from this narrative.
Whose interests are being served.
Whose voices are being silenced.
Those are important questions to ask.
They are, and it leads us to a broader point, this whole deep dive into propaganda.
Yeah.
It's really been about media literacy.
Right.
Developing the skills and the awareness to navigate this complex information landscape.
It's about becoming active participants.
Rather than passive consumers.
And recognizing that we have a responsibility to be discerning.
To question what we see and hear.
To seek out multiple perspectives.
And to share information responsibly.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has, and you've really helped me to connect the dots, you know, between the book and the sources that I brought.
Yeah, seeing how these ideas play out in the real world.
It really is a journey.
It is a journey, and remember, this is just the beginning.
Right.
The more we learn about this, the better equipped we are to resist it.
And to make informed choices.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We hope you found it enlightening, and we encourage you to keep exploring this topic.
It's an important one.
It is, and most importantly, keep asking those critical questions.
Question everything.
Don't be afraid to challenge the narratives that are being presented to you.
Find your own truth.
Exactly. Thanks for listening.